Hello Patreons, and welcome to my tutorial on how I created this piece called Kindred Spirits. Now I start off by working on the background in this top left corner and just sketching in the general shapes. The background is pine needles and little sticks and leaves. So I'm not too worried about following the reference photo, just getting the general gist of what the texture that I'm looking for, and just getting in those shadows and darkening them up. I'm just using a dark sepia and a bit of warm grey 4. I'm just going over it with some different browns. I use a lot of burnt sienna, walnut brown, nougat, burnt ochre, a whole mix of things, and a kaput mortem, kaput mortem violet, and of course black, just to darken it up a bit more. And just keeping my layers light and not putting much pressure on, so I can put in a lot of different layers. Just making sure that I get a good coverage of pigment onto the paper before I blend it out. And I'm blending it out with Spectrum Odourless Solvent on the brush, and that's a filbert brush. And I do make sure I don't have too much on the brush, because you don't want to saturate the paper, otherwise you'll have to wait for quite a while before it dries, before you can continue on, because you can damage the tooth of the paper if you go over it when it's still wet. Adding in a bit of purple morph before blending it out again, and see how much deeper the colour is this time with that second lot of layering. At this point, I'm just coming over with warm grey 2 and just adding in some highlights on those pine needles and getting a bit of texture in there. Not worried too much about where everything is, just getting the general sort of texture. I don't have to get every pine needle in exactly the same spot as on the reference photo. And now onto the hair, and I'm just roughly sketching in where all the different clumps of hair are. And this girl has quite straight hair, so it doesn't have quite the usual curves, waves and curves, which makes the clumps of hair more defined. In this one, because it's quite straight, you're just sort of following the shape of the hair with the shadows and putting clumps in, but not huge wavy clumps. And just building up those layers. And as you can see, I'm not putting in every strand of hair, I'm just focusing on those clumps. Now coming over with the warm grey to lighten it up, and with that hair that is flicking out a bit over the top of the rest, that one I will do some little strands in and make it more wispy. But that's because it's this little clump that is going over the top of the rest of the hair. So, but for the rest, I don't worry about the little strands of hair. Just slowly building up the layers using my Polychromos white as well. And that one is useful on colour pencils. Other people find it isn't as useful. It's not as opaque as a white luminance pencil, but it has its uses. And it's good for adding in softer highlights. And now working on the next section of the hair and just getting in those shadowed areas, the shadowed clumps, before going over with my other browns to get that base layer of colour in. And I always tend to try and do a base layer of colour because that helps. Before you try doing detail, you want a good coverage of the papers that you can blend out and get rid of the white flecks of paper. If you are trying to do the detail at the same time, when you blend it, you will lose quite a bit of that detail. It's much better to try and get the base colour down before going for the finer details in the piece. And when I'm drawing, I'm continually rotating the pencil in my hand, and that helps to keep the tip of the pencil sharp, and so you can get finer points, finer lines. if you do drawing with a blunter pencil, you'll end up with thick lines and they won't look as good, especially when drawing hair. You want the fine lines to get the detail that you're after. Otherwise the hair will look really thick and chunky and not look realistic, which is something to keep in mind when drawing hair. And with the hair around the part, do pay attention to which way it's going in the reference photo, because it does change direction depending on how the hair is coming out of the part area. You see I'm adding a fair bit of orange in. This girl does have reddish hair, so I'm using that on in the lighter areas on the hair to get that really vibrant orange look. I also find that sometimes with colours like orange, if you put white down first and go over it with orange, it will stand out better than if you'd try to go on and do the orange straight on top of the darker colour. It won't show up. So either use a white pencil, or you can use the titanium powder by brush and pencil and put a bit of that down, and the pencil, the orange or the yellow, would go over that and actually stand out. I'm just getting that little feather in, just paying attention to where the stripes are on either side of the feather. Again, no one's going to look at it and go, oh, that feather's wrong. So you don't have to be exact. You don't have to worry if it's not exactly like the reference photo. It's like with the hair in the background. You're not going to know. If you had the reference side by side with the art piece, you'd notice then if there's bits and pieces which are different. But looking at the piece on its own, you're not going to notice. So when it's those sorts of cases, I don't worry as much about being exactly like the reference photo. I change things and mix it up a little bit and find ways to make the drawing easier. When you're trying to be exactly like the reference photo, it takes a lot more time because you've got to keep comparing it back to the reference photo to make sure you're getting it exactly right. I found this section of the hair a little bit confusing when I was trying to follow the reference photo, because it kind of went back over the back of her shoulder, but also some of it went over the front of her shoulder. It kind of went in all sorts of different directions. And so I got a bit confused when I was drawing it. I had some shadows in and I ended up changing it a little bit further on. At least with this section of the hair, it was adaptable. Like I could alter it if I wanted to, just move the shadow a little bit. An area like the skin, you can't sort of change it as easily. You can't fix up mistakes. And I'm coming over with the white luminance pencil and just bringing out some of those highlights, and then going over it with the orange and the yellow to make them stand out a lot more. Now onto the face. I'm starting with a light layer of cinnamon. And then going over it with, I think that one's medium flash. Just darkening up those shadows. With the face, pay attention to your reference photo. This is one area where you do want to be just like the reference photo. If you put a shadow slightly in a different spot, it will change the whole shape of the face. It'll change how the cheekbones sit or how the nose is shaped, and it will make the face go from the one you want to draw to one you don't recognize. And it is very small things like that can change it. So do pay attention to the shape of the nose, the chin, the lips, the upper lip part between the nose and the top lip, the edge of the face on this one behind the furthest eye, that whole eyebrow shape. I actually end up in, not this part, but the next section when I'm working on it, where I actually change that brow shape slightly when I blend it out, and it's only later that I realised that I did that, and I actually had to come back and try and reshape that brow area. And it was simple enough to do, but in some pieces it wouldn't have been, and so you try and avoid that from the start. See, when I've blended it out, I've actually smoothed it out, whereas there should actually be a little bump in there. And same with the part where it's back behind the nose. How that area has been smoothed out when I blended it. Got to watch out for that. And coming through and darkening up the shadows a bit more. Just always keeping a light pressure on the pencil. And I do tend to go in little circles or little pencil strokes, depending on how the skin looks. More little little circles, because if you have lines, they tend to be more likely to be seen, and for skin you want it to look smooth. So after I blended it out that last time, now I'm coming over it with the Luminance white pencil. And this one has quite a lot of wax in it, so I find that when you blend it on top of colour, it makes a nice smooth layer, and it can smooth out the skin quite a lot. You do have to realise that it will lighten the colour a lot, so I made it intentionally darker than it was going to be by adding in more colours and more shadows than I wanted, so that when I go over it with the white pencil, it doesn't lighten it too far. Just adding in some more. And the other luminance pencils I used were Burnt Sienna 10%, Violet Grey, Burnt Ochre 50%, Primrose, and of course the white as well. Now that silver thing that I've got is just a pencil extender. Just because my white pencil's getting a bit short. Just deepening those shadows a bit more. I'm paying attention to how the shadow goes in the eyelid, between the eyebrow and the eyelashes, because the girl's got her eyes shut. Do pay attention to how that shadow goes, even when they're open. Definitely pay attention to how it goes, because that can change the shape of the eye as well. If you make that the shadow of the eyelid, that wrinkle that you get, if you make it too thick, that changes the whole dimensions of the eye. I purposely didn't make her lips too red. I didn't want them to look unnatural, and they're still a bit redder than what her skin is. If you want it to look completely like she didn't have makeup on, then you'd want to pick just a slightly darker colour than the skin. So you don't want to make it too bright and too obviously a different shade to the skin. I'm paying attention to the little creases in the lips, because lips are not smooth. You want to add in the little creases. Just adding now a little bit of Primrose to your skin, because the white does make it feel very flat, I find, because there's not much colour in white, obviously. So sometimes I find the primrose works a bit better. And I've also gone over it with the cream just to make her skin go from being sort of stark white and white pale colour to a bit more like it's actually alive. Sometimes if you make a person's skin too white, you may find that people may think that the skin is dead. So do pay attention to that. And there are people who have very, very pale skin. I mean, I myself have very pale skin, but you still want to add some colour to it. You don't want it completely stark white. Now just back onto that hair and adding in some strands over the cheek. I ended up adding a few more in than was on the reference photo just because I thought that it looked good. And because it's dark hair, it's quite easy to add it in after I've done the skin. If it had been a light coloured hair, either you'd want to protect that section of paper and keep it white when you're doing the skin, or you could potentially go over it with a titanium white mixed with a touch-up texture and then use that to lighten where the hair strands go, and then add colour on top of that if you wanted to add it in after, because sometimes when you try to go around an area, it's obvious that you went around it in your drawing. So going on top of it can look a lot more natural. So that's just a couple of different methods to keep in mind. Now onto the cloth on this part of the dress. I'm just making it up as I go along because I wasn't entirely sure how to get the fabric to look the way I wanted it. So I'm using the mix of mostly luminance pencils at the moment, the violet grey and the burnt sienna and the burnt ochre, and just building up the shadows. And working out where I'm putting all the shadows in on the little wrinkles in the fabric. And this is another area where you don't have to pay attention to, well, you do have to pay attention to the reference photo, but you don't have to follow it exactly. No one's going to know if you put one of those creases in a slightly different spot. As long as the general shape and direction of those wrinkles are all going in the right way, and that near enough is good enough. So you just do your best. You don't have to follow it exactly. I'm adding in lots of different colours to get this fabric to get that sort of shimmery look that it has in the reference photo. It's quite an interesting colour to try and replicate. It's kind of peachy colour, very pale, very sheer. It's quite a difficult fabric to replicate. I wasn't really sure how I was going to do it. So this section is my test section, trying to figure out how I get that effect before I go on to the rest of it with knowing what I want to do, how I mix the colours to get the effect. And this section is also a bit darker than the rest of the fabric because it is under her head, so it's in shadow. Using the primrose to bring some of those highlights out. Now using violet grey just to sketching the next section of the fabric and the shadows. And darkening some of the shadows with black. I'm using a smaller brush for the blending, just because it is a finer area and you don't want all the black being blended over the lighter area, so the smaller brush gives you a lot more control. Then onto the background in the bottom left corner, and just sketching in the general outlines of the leaves and the pine needles, getting those shadows in. Making sure I get a good layer of pigment on the paper before I blend. As you can see, I use quite a lot of different browns to get the effect of the pine needles. There's not just one or two, there's heaps, and there's purple as well. And the purple helps to deepen those shadows quite a lot and make it a richer black rather than just a flat black. I never tend to put black down by itself. It always gets put down with another colour. And if you find your black is looking very flat, you can add like a dark red and a dark purple, and you just mix those other dark colours in with the black, and it really enhances the colour. It makes it a much richer black than what it would have been if you'd just done the black pencil. Some people say not to use black on it, black, and you always have to try and create your black from dark purples and dark reds and mixing them together, and dark browns as well. But I find the black pencil, I definitely use it a lot, and I just don't tend to have it on its own. I always mix it with something else to just make it a bit more richer. And here I'm just using a bit of earth grey on the lichen on the branch. Not too much, just enough to add a hint of green in there so it's not just all brown and red. I'm blending it all out. And then deepening the shadows a bit more with black. And focusing mostly on the texture of the area, not on the different shapes. I wasn't really paying attention to, oh, that's a branch with lichen on it, and those are needles and leaves there. I was just looking at the sort of abstract shapes that I could see in the reference photo and sort of mimicking them. I wasn't thinking, oh, there's a needle, got to get that needle there, or that's a branch. A lot of the times, if you think of things as abstract shapes, when you're working on little sections, it doesn't make much sense, but when you've got the whole, then you can see what it is. And that's how I find with a lot of things, you can't necessarily see what it is when you're working on the little section, but when you put the whole together, it makes sense. So flowers is one thing that always seems to be like that. Doesn't make much sense when you're doing each little petal. They can look quite strange, depending on how they're folded and how the shadows are on them. But when you get the whole flower all together, then each petal all together, they make sense. I'm just putting in some highlights. And just keep darkening the shadows and layering them to get them to the desired darkness. And then onto the shoulder area. Now this I started with cream this time and then went over with light flesh. And a bit of cinnamon as well, and then just building up the shadows now. I found that the cream as the first layer I put down, that makes a big difference with how luminant the skin looks. It makes it look a lot nicer having that cream as the base colour, which I didn't do on the face. I ended up adding it later on. But yeah, I definitely preferred the cream as the first layer. So that's what I'll do next time. As always, I find that when I take a piece, I don't know exactly what I'm going to do or how I'm going to approach it. I just sort of approach it like an experiment. I try things, see how it goes. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. I don't worry about that. I'm always trying new things, trying different combinations of colours and seeing what works and what doesn't. But I don't have a set formula for how I approach skin or hair or anything. I don't know exactly what colour to put down first. It all depends on the lighting, the particular shade of skin. If the light is a bit on the cooler side, it'll change how the skin looks. So there's no set colour scheme for skin. I find it changes with every photo, with every subject. So I just sort of have a go, see how it goes, and make it up as I go along. Blending it all out, making the pencil marks smoother, and just building up those layers. And going over it with the Luminance white pencil gives it that white, shiny look and smooth look to the skin that I like. And adding in a little bit of hair over the top so that it makes it sort of feel like it's sort of with the next to the hair, not just separate. And when you're doing those little strands of hair, make sure that your pencil is sharp. And because if you do let it be a little bit blunt, the strands will be thicker and they won't look as nice. You want nice thin lines when you're doing hair. And now onto the arm. So I've started again with cream, then sketching in shading in the shadows with Kaput Mortem, and making sure that my layers are nice and light. I'm also keeping my pencil strokes as even as possible, not pressing down in one area harder than another, so that you get a nice smooth graduation of the pencil across the area. If you press too hard with some pencil strokes and not with others, it's harder to blend that out and get that smoother, especially for an area like skin. You want that to come up smooth at the end. So I've also used cinnamon and the Luminance Violet Grey, and also adding in a little bit of mauve into the shadows and Indian Red, and just building up those different colours. As you see, there's not just one colour that I use to get the flesh tone, and even when it's pale skin, it's not just the flesh pencil, you use a lot of different colours to build up the shade of skin. If you just use one colour, it will end up looking flat and it won't have that luminance, the luminance feel that and vibrant feel that skin has. You want lots of different shades and different colours, and they just blend together to make the skin look really realistic and nice. So I'm blending and just building up those shadows a bit more and getting a nice even layer across the whole area, and then blending it all out again. Making sure I don't use too much of the solvent on the brush at this point, because it will start looking splotchy if I do. So I'm being quite careful with how much solvent is on the brush. Now just going over with a layer of a white luminance pencil, and that helps to give it that really smooth effect because of the extra wax in that pencil over the Polychromos. And when that blends out, it just does a sheen over the whole area and makes it quite a nice pale, smooth look. Though you do have to watch using the white like that, because you can get the skin looking very white, and the white skin is not actually white. It works in this picture because I wanted the girl to look very pale, and that's how she is in the reference photo. But you've got to make sure that the skin doesn't look dead. You want to go over it with a bit of colour. So yeah, I went over it with a light flesh just to warm the white up a little bit. And that's something you can definitely do over the top of the white luminance pencil, is just add a little bit of colour to warm the white up a bit. You could also use the primrose colour, which is a cream, and that would work as well to add a little bit of yellow into that. But you've got to be careful not to do too much yellow for skin, because too much yellow can make the skin look a little bit sick, like you got jaundice. But a little bit to make the skin warm rather than the cold white works well. Now I'm onto the fox, and I'm just getting in the base layer of colour for the back area on the fox for his fur. Just making sure there's enough pigment on the paper so when I blend it, it blends smoothly. Not worrying as much about pencil strokes, just getting a nice even coverage, though I am starting to add in a little bit more definition with the fur and getting some of those shadows in. I'm blending that out now. And as you can still see some of that definition of the fur direction, but not a heap. It just gives the hint of it, and in my next layer I'll further define the direction of the fur. Adding some orange and different browns to darken that colour. And at this point, you need to start paying attention to your reference photo. You do want to make sure that the fur is going in the right direction. And as I'm going over in this layer, I'm using pencil strokes and making sure that I'm paying attention to how long the fur is, so that you don't do long pencil strokes when you have short fur, because the length of your pencil strokes will dictate how long the fur looks. So you keep the pencil strokes in this section, it's kind of like a medium length. It's not really short, but they're not really long. And I'm paying attention to the direction of the fur because it kind of changes a bit across the back. So you want to make sure that you're getting it in the right direction. And blending it out again. And with fur, you don't need to worry as much about the splotchiness that you get if you use too much solvent. You don't want to wet the page too much because then you have to wait for it to dry. But with fur, if you get a bit of a splotchy look with the solvent, it's not as, it doesn't matter as much, unlike where you do the skin. Just starting to define the fur a bit more now using my white luminance pencil. I'm just paying attention to the fur direction and the length of the pencil marks, because this is where it definitely starts showing. If you get those things wrong, it won't look right. You definitely want to pay attention to your reference photo when you're doing the final details on the fur. And onto the next section of the fox's back, and just getting in that base layer of colour and building up the depth and making sure there's enough pigment on the page before blending it. I'm using the Caput Mortem to build up those shadows there. And with coloured pencils, especially when you're working on watercolour paper, don't go too dark all at once. It's better to start light and build up those layers, darkening the shadows as you go along, instead of starting with the shadows going really, really dark and then finding that you've gone too dark and you can't. It's quite difficult to lighten an area once it's already dark. So when you're doing it, that's why I tend to work light to dark. So as you saw, I put down all the lighter layers and built those up, and then I started adding in the shadows, and then I blend it, and then in this next section of layering, I then build up those shadows even further, and you just sort of work like that. You keep, with each layer, you can make it darker and darker, and until you get to the darkness that you want. And here I'm just building up some of those highlighted areas with the warm grey. That one's warm grey too, and just using that rather than the white. Sometimes the white's too bright, so you want more subtle colour, and warm grey, in this case, because the fur's got that warm orangey red colour, so that's why I went with the warm grey rather than the cold grey. It works quite well to add in little tiny highlights, and then going over on top with the white. I'd already built up some depth in that fur in the highlighted areas with the warm grey. And just keep building up the layers to get it to the point that I want it. And at the end of doing this artwork, I come back with the titanium white powder mixed with the touch-up texture by brush and pencil, and I mix them together to make a paint-like mixture and paint it on, and that adds some really good highlights in. So while I've moved on to the next section, I haven't actually finished that section of the fur yet, because I want to bring in some really light white fur. Not too much, to just give a little touch of the lighter fur in there. And I'll do that right at the end. I find it's easier to use that all at once across the whole piece rather than making up small bits for every different section. And with all my pieces, I don't necessarily have a section finished until I've finished the whole piece. So once I'm at the end, I always have a look at it and work out what needs more highlights, what needs darker shadows, if an area needs some of the colours from the background brought in. You make that final judgment once you've completed the whole piece, and actually then you figure out if it's finished or not. And just repeating what I did with the other sections of fur and building up the layers and getting that the intensity of the colour that I want. And watching the fur length. So in this section, it's actually the tail. So the fur is actually longer than on the back. So I am doing longer lines and longer pencil strokes. Still being very careful with how I'm doing them. I'm not putting them just all over the place. I am paying attention to the reference photo. And then building up the light section on the edge of the tail where the fur is quite a lot. It's had a white section. It's not completely white, but yeah, it had a lot more white fur along that edge there. And when I'm using the Luminance pencil, the white one, I'm rotating it a lot to try and keep the point sharp. So what I do with my pencils is I rotate them as I work so that it keeps the point as sharp as possible, so I don't have to keep going back and sharpening it. And this is another section of the fur that I'll come over with the titanium white powder. Just adding in a little bit more detail in amongst the fur, adding in little shadows in there. And now I'm just cleaning up the edge along the hand where the fur is, making sure that is nice and neat. Adding in a little shadow there where you've got the edge of the thumb that you can see. And now I'm just adjusting the hair and putting in some strands on top of the fur. And that just reinforces that the face is above the fox, and so that she's cuddling into the fox fur rather than feeling that they're on the same sort of level. And for this section, taking the Luminance Violet Grey and just sketching in where the little shadows are in the wrinkles in the clothing, and just looking at the reference photo, but not worrying too much about getting them in exactly the right places. With clothes, as long as the general sort of shape of the cloth is right, then that's enough. You don't need to get it exactly right. And then just darkening some of those shadows up with the black. I'm not going too dark with the black, just darkening it a little bit. And just used a bit of the cream then, and also darkening it with the cinnamon. And lots of different little colours that I use to get the shade just right. And here you see I'm darkening those shadows up a bit more now. It's much easier to judge how dark you want to go when you've got the area filled in with colour, as opposed to when you've got sections of white. So that's another reason why sometimes I'll wait until the very end of the piece when all the white has been covered to darken some of the shadows even further, because then I can judge it better if the area is dark enough. Because when things are up against the white of the paper, that actually changes how you view the colours next to it. So they'll appear darker than what they actually are because the white is so bright, and that can change how much shading you've actually put on the page. So you've got to always bear that in mind, that once that white of the paper has been removed, that it might change how the area that you thought was finished looks, and you actually need to go back and alter it a bit more. Sketching in the shadows again with the violet grey. Love that pencil. It's a great colour. It's grey, but it just has this little touch of the violet in it. And yeah, it just works perfectly, so it's not a flat grey. Sometimes grey can, same with black, if you don't add other colours in with the black, it can look quite flat. So this one's a great one for shadows, especially in this area where you don't want the shadows too dark. You just want the hint of the shadows. And for this part, I'm sketching in the shadows because if I don't do it at this point, where I can see the lines that I've lightly drawn in already, if I don't do it at this point and start layering the colour over the top, I'll lose all those lines and I won't be able to see them. And if that happens, then I won't have anything to guide where the shadows are going. So that's why I'm doing it at this point, to make sure I don't lose where all those lines are. And I'm just going over with a light layer of cream. And it gives the clothing this nice soft yellow tinge to it. Not too yellow, just more on off-white, because it's kind of a peachy colour, faint peach. It's not a very bright peach at all. Material, but like when it's in the light, that peach sort of fades to a yellow colour, so it's a very pale fabric. So there's not a lot of colour in it at all. I love doing all the folds in this material. It was absolutely beautiful. And in this piece, I changed the area that where the waistband is. I changed it from the reference photo, because in the reference photo it had blue and some other colours in it, blues and browns. But I didn't think that the blue would suit the feel of the artwork I was going for with all the reds and browns. So I decided to just drop the blue and just have it as wrinkles of the same colour as the material everywhere else. Also because there wasn't enough of the waistband in my piece to really get the effect of the blue in the waistband for it to look good. If I'd shown more of her body, then maybe the waistband would have looked better with that contrasting colour. I'm just building up those layers in the shadows again. Lots of layers. And as always, keeping those layers very light. If you press too hard, you flatten the tooth of the paper, and then that really limits how many layers you can get onto the paper. Whereas if you keep the layers light, you can keep going back and back. So many layers. It's actually rare that I can't keep going back with more layers. I find sometimes with the luminance pencils, the extra wax in that can make it a little bit harder to go back for more layers. But with the Polychromos, there's so many layers. I rarely get to the point where I'm like, oh, I can't actually put any more down. Yeah, the way that I work, I don't burnish very often at all. So I don't get that limiting the layering. So burnishing is when you push really hard with the pencil, and that's a method of blending. So it tends to blend the pencil beneath it together. But once you've burnished, you can't really add any more layers on top of that because you've flattened the tooth of the paper. And just deepening those shadows a little bit more, adding a little bit of colour in too. So before I added a bit of purple into the shadows, and I'm putting a little more of a reddish brown and just some of the little folds, just so that it's not all a flat colour. Got a little bit more interest in the fabric. I'm just sharpening up some of those lines there so that they're a bit sharper, because sometimes when you blend it out, you lose some of the intensity of the colour and the sharpness. I'm just blending that out. With this section, I'm not worried too much if I put too much solvent on the brush. Because any splotchiness can kind of be explained by the fabric, but also when I was blending, I was using the brush following the lines of the fabric, the folds. So if there were splotches, they would tend to follow those folds, and that would hide those splotches, and you don't even notice them really. And so that's a trick you can use to help you if you do find in sections where, like fabric, and also with fur, if you're following the lines of the fur, the direction of the fur, you can hide things like that, so you don't have to be as careful, such as making sure that you've wiped all the excess solvent off the brush. But you definitely have to do that when you're working on skin. So now I'm onto the face of the fox, and I'm doing similar to what I did with the back. I've put in base colours, made sure I got the eye in and the nose in the right spots, and just using the warm grey 4 and 2 to add fur in on the little white patch on its nose. And you don't necessarily actually have to blend that section out. If you keep your pencils sharp, that when you put in the fur lines for that section, that actually gives that texture on the area. You don't have to blend out the white area, because you don't tend to put enough pigment on that area for it to need blending. And then onto the next section. Just start layering the colour in and paying attention to where I've put lines. So I'm making sure that putting in some darker marks, just adding in a little bit more pressure, not too much though, and also going over it a little bit more so that it's a bit, a couple more layers of pigment in those darker areas, and just of the same colour, so that I can work out where the shapes are on the face. So you've got to make sure you get the ear right. So definitely follow your reference photo for the ear. If fur goes in all sorts of directions in the ear, and it can get quite complicated. And if you don't get the ear right, it will put the whole sort of face off. So if you're going for the realistic look, definitely pay attention to the fur in the ear and the shape of the ear. You've got some animal ears have interesting folds in them that just don't seem to make any sense whatsoever sometimes. But yeah, if you don't put those folds skin in there and the weird direction in the fur, how it goes pretty much all directions, if you don't get that, then the ear will look wrong. And as you can see, I've gone through with the darker browns and made sure that I'm getting the direction of the fur in, so that I don't lose those lines, especially around the ear area, but also between the ear and the eye. You've got to make sure you don't lose them, especially when you've sketched them out previously, and then you do that base layer of colour. Sometimes if you're not careful, you can lose all those lines because the colour obviously covers it up. So in that case, you want to make sure that before you lose those lines beneath the colour, you go over with a darker colour and get those lines in again. And now just blending it all out. I love it when you do that first layer and then it just smooths all those pencil lines out, and it makes the whole area just makes sense. Whereas it looks so sketchy before you blend it out. Building up those layers, making the colour a bit more intense. Making sure I get that cream in there as well. Even though you don't necessarily notice the cream and you won't see it in the final piece, like you won't look at it and go, oh, there's cream there. You need it to add just that warmth, that yellow tinge to the fur. I'm paying attention to the reference photo, especially in this area. And I will be coming back at the end with the titanium white powder, and that will bring the fur in the ear. I'll go over the ear area to make that stand out really well and get in all those little fine furs. I find before the titanium white powder mixed with the touch-up texture, before I had that, I would go through for the really white areas and use the white pencil first and press quite hard, so I sort of burnish that spot to protect the really white highlights and white furs and whiskers, and do that before you do any other colouring on the piece. And so that would sort of protect that area before you colour it and blend over the top of it. However, with the titanium white, you don't need to worry about that because it goes on top of any of your colour. You can do that right at the end, and it just makes it so much easier for those sorts of little details. Though, as you can see, the luminance white does go over the colour quite well. It's just when you're trying to get the really white fur or really white whiskers, and that you need the titanium white, or to have protected it right at the start. Now onto the second hand. Now I found this one I struggled with quite a bit. Because I'd done the fox in between doing the skin on the other hands, I sometimes find that when you have time separating from working on one area to another, it's hard to actually match to the first section, and especially with this one where it's skin and you can actually tell the skin looks different. When I was working on this, I obviously did the layers slightly differently, and it did not look quite the same. It came out a lot darker and duller, and yeah, I needed to have stopped, looked at my video footage and actually worked out what layers I did before working on this section, because it ended up looking quite dull. I come over later with the titanium white powder mixed with the touch-up texture, and I whitened that quite a bit because I actually found I was starting to burnish that area, trying to get it to look the same as the other hand. And yeah, found with the titanium white powder I was able to fix that up at the end, but yeah, it was a bit frustrating for me for a bit there. I ended up deciding just to go on with the material in this section and get that completed, because once that was in, I could then judge the values on that second hand a lot better. So this section of material went quite quickly. It was quite easy to just match it to the area I'd worked on just before the fox head. And just making sure that the saturation of the yellow was enough to match the fabric in the top part. Now, this is where I'm going over with the titanium white powder mixed with the touch-up texture. And I'm just painting it on with a liner brush and just going over, adding in little spots all over the piece. Sometimes I find I paint it on and then dab it with my finger, like on the hand there, and that sort of smooths it out and smudges it a bit, so you don't get quite a strong line. But you can see how well that put those highlights on top of all that colour. It works great. I love that stuff. And here you go. You can see the final piece, and I hope that this tutorial has been useful, and thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. Thank you. I'll see you next time.